Hi, welcome everyone. It's a fun idea if you could let us know where you're tuning in from. Appreciate it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's relax and kick things off. I sat across from her, the flicker of candlelight reflecting in the wine glass between us, casting shadows on her delicate face. She looked serene, almost angelic, sipping her Pinot Noir with a smile that had once seemed genuine to me. Now every twitch of her lips, every tilt of her head, felt like an intricate performance, one she had mastered over the years. The restaurant was the same one where we had celebrated our anniversaries, birthdays, and promotions. It felt suffocating now, filled with the ghosts of a life I had believed in. The irony of it all, the place where our happiest moments lived was now the stage for my darkest realizations. I watched her, my wife, my betrayer. She had no idea that I knew. Not yet. "How's your steak?" she asked, her tone light, unconcerned, as though everything was perfectly fine. As though she wasn't stabbing me in the heart every day, she continued her affair. I smiled back, a practiced, polite smile, the kind you give to strangers at a cocktail party. "It's perfect," I said, cutting into the meat without really tasting it. "Everything's perfect." She returned my smile, her eyes lingering on me for just a moment longer than necessary before she looked back down at her plate. I wondered how often she had looked at me like that, pretending everything was normal. Did she feel any guilt at all? Or had she convinced herself that I was too blind, too stupid to ever figure it out? She shifted in her seat, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I'd known for months now, found the messages, the late-night phone calls, the whispers she thought I couldn't hear. They were clever about it, but not clever enough. Her lover had even gotten comfortable enough to joke about me, calling me the clueless husband. They laughed at me behind my back, mocking my ignorance. Except I wasn't ignorant anymore. I had chosen silence for now. I had chosen control. I let her continue with the evening, watched as she ordered dessert, a creme brulee, as though we were just another happy couple indulging in the simple pleasures of life. She had no idea that each minute I sat there, I was mentally sharpening the knives. This was all part of the plan. I took a sip of my wine, swirling it slowly in my mouth, savoring the bitterness. It tasted like resentment, like the months of deception she had fed me. I studied her movements, the way she gently tapped her spoon against the hard shell of the creme brulee, breaking through with ease, never knowing that I was about to do the same to her. But not tonight. No, tonight wasn't the night for revelations. I was savoring the tension, the power of knowing something she didn't. Her ignorance was intoxicating, and I'd long stopped feeling the initial sting of betrayal and replaced it with something much more focused, much more dangerous, the desire to regain control. She smiled again, talking about her plans for the week, what errands she needed to run, the work events she had to attend. She didn't know that I had already checked her schedule, knew exactly when and where she would be meeting him. She had no idea that her entire life was already in my hands, and I was slowly, methodically squeezing. "I was thinking," she said, her voice casual, but I could see the small hesitation, the brief pause before she spoke. "Maybe we should take a weekend trip, just the two of us." The nerve of her. The audacity to suggest we play the role of a happy couple, even as she plotted to be in his arms the moment I turned my back. I had to give her credit. She was a good actress, too good. But I was done playing my part as the oblivious husband. "That sounds nice," I replied, keeping my voice steady, hiding the edge behind it. "We could use some time away." Her eyes lit up, her relief almost palpable. She thought she was in control, pulling the strings, manipulating the narrative. But every word she spoke, every smile she gave, only added more weight to her eventual downfall. This was the game I had chosen, a slow burn. I wasn't going to explode in a fit of rage or accusations. No, I was going to destroy her piece by piece as she had done to me. I would unravel her world so thoroughly that when she finally realized what was happening, it would already be too late. I leaned back in my chair, studying her as she laughed at some small joke I hadn't even heard. She thought she had me fooled. She thought her secret was safe. But the truth was already out, and I was holding it like a loaded gun, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. When I think back to the beginning, it feels like a different life altogether. We met at a company event, an annual conference where the drinks flowed as freely as the introductions. She stood out from the crowd immediately. It wasn't just her looks, though she was beautiful in an understated way, all elegance and grace. It was her presence. Confident, magnetic, drawing people in without ever having to compete for attention. I was one of many who gravitated toward her that evening, but somehow I was the one she chose to speak with after the party ended. That was the beginning of everything. We fell in love fast, or at least I did. I was certain she felt the same. Back then, she was attentive, loving, all the things that convinced me this was a partnership for life. Our wedding day came a year later, and I remember the way she looked walking down the aisle. I felt like the luckiest man alive. We built our life together over time. Careers flourished. We bought a house, made friends, hosted dinner parties. It was what anyone would call a successful marriage. If I try hard enough, I can still recall those early days with some sense of fondness, though it's tainted now. There were vacations to Europe, lazy weekends spent curled up on the couch with a bottle of wine, long conversations about our future. We made plans, or at least I thought we were making plans together. She was always good at creating the illusion that we were in sync. But the cracks started showing, subtly at first. In the beginning, they were things I dismissed, small moments I chalked up to the normal wear and tear of married life. It started with the late nights at work. She had just taken on a new role, more responsibility, more stress. I understood that. I had my own career demands. We were both ambitious, and I admired that in her. So when she began working longer hours, I didn't question it. I trusted her, trusted us. Then there were the canceled plans. A dinner reservation here, a weekend getaway there. She always had a reasonable explanation. An emergency at work, an unexpected meeting. She apologized, said she would make it up to me. And she always did in small ways that kept me from digging deeper. She was good at that. A small gesture, a kind word, and I would push away any lingering doubts, convinced that everything was fine. But there were moments, flashes of suspicion that I would quickly bury. I didn't want to be that husband, the paranoid one who second-guessed his wife at every turn. Besides, she had never given me any reason to doubt her before. Why would I start now? It wasn't until years later that I realized how carefully she had curated the narrative of our life. I had been blind, yes, but not stupid. I had dismissed the signs because I didn't want to see them, not because they weren't there. Looking back, it's easy to pinpoint the moments that should have made me pause, but at the time, I was too trusting, too invested in the idea of us to believe anything else. One of those moments was her growing detachment. It was subtle at first, like a change in the weather, small, almost imperceptible shifts. She started spending more time on her phone, always with a convenient excuse for why she couldn't talk. A text from work, a friend needing advice. At night, when I asked about her day, her answers became shorter, less detailed. I figured she was just tired, overworked. She smiled less at home, but in public, she was still the same charming, captivating woman everyone loved. The contrast confused me, but I never voiced my concerns. Instead, I worked harder to fix it, thinking it was just a rough patch. I was a fool. Even when she pulled away physically, I convinced myself that it was temporary. She was distant in bed, often finding reasons to go to sleep early or claiming exhaustion. When we did have sex, it felt mechanical, like something she was doing out of obligation rather than desire. I tried to address it, but she assured me it was stress from work, nothing more. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Then there were the business trips, which became more frequent. At first, I didn't think much of it. Her job required travel. So did mine. But something about the way she prepared for these trips began to bother me. She would pack days in advance, often with more enthusiasm than she ever showed for our weekend getaways. And then there was the perfume. It was subtle but unmistakable. She started wearing a different scent, one I hadn't smelled before, one I hadn't bought for her. When I asked about it, she waved it off as a free sample she liked. These were the little things I dismissed, convincing myself they were inconsequential. But they were all part of the larger story I was too blind to see. There were moments, though, that should have shattered my denial. The time she came home late from a work dinner, with her hair a little too disheveled, the faintest trace of lipstick smeared. I asked her about it, my heart pounding in my chest. She laughed it off, told me she had touched up her makeup in the car and it must have smudged. She kissed me lightly, almost mechanically, and I let the moment pass. I didn't want to believe the alternative. The first time I truly began to suspect something was wrong was when a friend of mine, someone I trusted, made an offhand comment. It wasn't anything direct, just a vague observation about how much my wife had been traveling lately. "You sure she's not working for the CIA or something?" he joked, laughing as he sipped his beer. The comment should have been harmless, but it lingered. That night I lay awake, replaying conversations, going over details in my head that I had previously ignored. The late nights, the distant behavior, the canceled plans, it all began to form a picture, one that I didn't want to see. Still, I didn't confront her. I told myself I needed more proof. I wasn't going to accuse her of something this serious without being absolutely sure. So I waited, watched, collected small pieces of evidence in the back of my mind. I became hyper-aware of her movements, her habits. I started to notice more things. A change in the way she answered her phone, the nervous glance when she thought I wasn't looking, the way she never let her phone out of her sight, and then one day everything fell into place. I came home early from a business trip. I hadn't told her I was coming back that night, intending to surprise her. But as I stepped into the house, I immediately knew something was wrong. Her car was in the driveway, but the house was too quiet. I walked in slowly, my heart already pounding, and that's when I heard it. Voices, faint but unmistakable, coming from the living room. I stood there, frozen in place, as I listened to her talking. Her tone was soft, affectionate, the way she used to talk to me. She laughed, and then I heard him, a man's voice, low and intimate, responding to her laughter with something I couldn't make out. It was in that moment that the foundation of our life, the one I had trusted so completely, crumbled beneath me. Everything that I had chosen to ignore, all the small signs, the lingering suspicions, came crashing down at once. I wasn't blind anymore. I wasn't stupid anymore. I knew. But I didn't confront her that night. I didn't storm into the room and demand answers. Instead, I turned around, walked out of the house, and got back into my car. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. But even then, I knew that anger alone wouldn't be enough. I wasn't going to lash out impulsively. I was going to plan. I was going to make sure that when the time came, she would feel every ounce of pain she had inflicted on me. That was the moment I decided. This wouldn't end with a confrontation. It would end with her ruin. The day I discovered the truth wasn't a particularly extraordinary one. I didn't wake up with a premonition, nor did I notice any new peculiarities in her behavior. It was just another Wednesday, one of those long, monotonous days where everything seems to drag. I came home later than usual after a tedious meeting, my mind fogged with the usual concerns of work, deadlines, and a minor disagreement I had with a colleague. I walked into the house tired and distracted, and it took me a moment to realize how quiet it was. No sounds from the TV, no music playing in the background, nothing. I stood in the entryway, loosening my tie, listening to the stillness. Something felt off, though I couldn't place it. I moved toward the kitchen where I saw her phone on the counter. This wasn't unusual in itself, but it was unlocked. A small detail, yes, but unlike her. She was always careful with her phone, always making sure it was locked the moment she wasn't using it. I glanced toward the stairs, listening for any sign of her. The house remained quiet. For reasons I couldn't yet explain, my hand reached out almost instinctively and picked up the phone. It was a simple swipe, a harmless gesture, I told myself, just to see what was on the screen. A message was open, the contents starkly displayed in front of me. The words were innocuous enough at first glance. "I'll miss you today. Can't wait for our next lunch. Same place? It could have been from a colleague or friend, but something about it made my chest tighten. I swiped up to see the earlier messages, and that's when my world started to tilt. Her lover's name appeared at the top of the chat, a name I didn't recognize but now felt seared into my brain. The more I scrolled, the worse it got. Intimate exchanges, plans for meetings when I was out of town, and worst of all, mocking remarks about me. The words cut deep, and I could feel my breath getting shallow as I read the messages, feeling like I was drowning in disbelief. One line stood out, stabbing at me repeatedly. He's clueless. I feel like I could say anything, and he'd just nod along like the fool he is. And her response, I know, it's almost too easy. He has no idea. I remember the moment when I stopped feeling. That numbness crept over me, dulling the sharp edge of the pain. There was no instant explosion of anger, no shouting or throwing things across the room. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I set the phone back down on the counter just as I'd found it and walked upstairs, silently replaying every interaction, every conversation, every look she had given me over the past several months. I was operating on autopilot. Everything became automatic. I ate dinner with her, smiled, and nodded at her small talk. The betrayal simmered under the surface, waiting for me to acknowledge its presence fully, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed to think. That night, I lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling. I could feel the space between us, so much larger than the mere inches that physically separated us. My mind worked overtime, calculating, planning. I wasn't going to react in the heat of the moment. I wasn't going to let anger cloud my judgment. She had been playing me for a fool, yeah, but the game wasn't over yet. In fact, it had only just begun. For the next few days, I played the role perfectly. I went to work, came home, and acted like nothing had changed. I was careful not to let anything slip, though my mind was consumed by the affair. I watched her closely, noted every move she made, every text she sent, every time she looked a little too relieved when I said I had a late meeting. I began collecting pieces of her deception, like a detective assembling evidence for a case. I had made my decision. I wouldn't confront her directly. Confrontation would be too simple, too fleeting. A fight, followed by tears, apologies, perhaps promises to change. None of it would be enough. No, she needed to feel what I was feeling, only worse. I needed her to experience the kind of devastation that lingered, the kind that crept up on you in the quiet moments when you thought you were safe. I wanted her to unravel, slowly and painfully, just like I had. My first step was to learn everything. If I was going to dismantle her life, I needed to know all the details. I began by quietly checking her phone when she was in the shower or had left it unattended. I pieced together her affair, how long it had been going on, where they met, the way she had used my trust against me. It had been over a year, but I couldn't let myself dwell on that. I couldn't afford to get distracted by the raw emotions that bubbled under the surface. Instead, I focused on control. I had a plan, and the more I learned, the more I could refine it. She was meticulous, I gave her that, but not as meticulous as me. She had been careful, making sure to meet him during the day when she knew I wouldn't be around. They used coded language in their texts, nothing explicit, though it was clear enough what they were doing. The sheer arrogance of it infuriated me, but I swallowed that anger and kept my calm. It wasn't the time yet. The more I gathered, the more I realized how comfortable she had become in her lies. That comfort would be her undoing. I started with small changes, things she wouldn't notice right away, but that would subtly make her life more difficult. I began shifting money out of our joint accounts and into a separate one she couldn't access. Not all at once, of course, just small amounts here and there. Enough that she might chalk it up to household expenses or misremembering a purchase. At the same time I started documenting everything, I created a detailed file on her, complete with timestamps of her meetings with him, copies of their messages, and even a few photos. I wanted to ensure that when the time came, there would be no doubt, no way for her to twist the narrative. I would control every part of it. Then came the social isolation. I didn't start by pulling away from her directly. That would have raised suspicion. Instead, I began subtly undermining her relationships with others. At first, it was just casual remarks to friends, things I knew would get back to her. A small comment about her being stressed or acting distant, a harmless observation that she had been spending a lot of time away from home. Little seeds of doubt planted in the minds of those closest to her. I watched as the effects began to take hold. She started noticing that her friends were calling less, that invitations to social events were fewer and farther between. She made a few remarks about it to me, almost offhand, but I could tell it bothered her. That was when I knew my plan was working. I moved on to her work. She prided herself on being a competent, reliable employee, someone who was always on top of things. So I made sure to disrupt that image. I started misplacing important documents at home, papers she needed for a big meeting, notes she had taken for a project. I didn't make it obvious, just enough to make her look careless, forgetful. The stress started to show. She began staying up later, working longer hours, trying to make up for the mistakes that weren't really hers. Her boss even called one evening to discuss a missed deadline, and I could hear the panic in her voice as she tried to explain it away. All the while, I remained calm, supportive even. I was the perfect husband, there to offer a sympathetic ear, to reassure her when things got tough. It was almost laughable, the irony of it all. She had no idea that the very person she was turning to for comfort was the one orchestrating her downfall. But this was only the beginning. The full extent of my plan was still unfolding, and I was careful not to rush it. I wanted her to feel the weight of her actions slowly, to have the realization creep up on her bit by bit until there was no escape. The final step would be public. I was saving that for last. I would wait until everything else had crumbled around her friendships, her career, her sense of security, and then I would expose her affair. Not just to me, but to everyone, Ateon. I wanted her humiliation to be complete, to be undeniable, but I wasn't there yet. For now, I continued to play my part, watched as her world began to fracture, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. The numbness that had settled in the night, I discovered the affair had transformed into something sharper, more focused. Every move I made was deliberate, calculated. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about control. It was about making her realize that she had never really had the upper hand, that I had been watching, waiting the entire time. She had taken everything from me, my trust, my love, my sense of stability, and now I was taking it all back, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for her to hold on to. I started with the small things, subtle, unnoticeable disruptions that would chip away at her stability without giving away my hand. It wasn't enough to destroy her suddenly. That would be too merciful, too quick. No, I wanted her to feel as if the very ground she walked on was crumbling, but without ever realizing why. Every move I made had to feel invisible, each step calculated and precise. The finances were the easiest place to start. We had always managed our money together, with shared accounts and mutual oversight. She trusted me with the day-to-day handling of most of our finances, and I had long been careful to maintain that image of responsibility. But now I began siphoning off small amounts from our accounts, not enough to raise alarms, but just enough to cause minor inconveniences. An extra payment here, an unbalanced bill there, nothing that would immediately draw her attention, but something that would start to wear on her over time. I knew her well enough to know how much she valued financial control. When she realized something was off, it wouldn't be a panic, just a seed of doubt planted in her mind. It wasn't long before I noticed her checking the account more frequently, though she said nothing to me. She was still too secure in her belief that she had me fooled, too confident that her secret was safe, that arrogance would be her undoing. Next came the social isolation. We moved in similar circles, shared many of the same friends, and attended the same events. But I began quietly, subtly manipulating those relationships. I made casual comments to our friends about her being stressed, about her pulling away from me. Nothing overt. Fired, just enough to plant a whisper of suspicion. A word here, a raised eyebrow there, and suddenly people began to see her differently. Friends would tell me later that they had noticed changes in her behavior, a growing distance. Of course, they didn't know it was I who had orchestrated those thoughts. She noticed the shift too. Her phone rang less often, invitations were fewer. When she asked me about it, I offered a sympathetic shrug, playing the supportive husband while watching her wonder what was happening. She began to question herself, but not me. Never me. I was the steady one, always there, always understanding. Even when she confided in me about feeling disconnected from her friends, I simply nodded along, pretending to care. Inside, I relished every moment of it. The more she leaned on me, the more I controlled her, and she didn't even see it. The psychological games were perhaps the most satisfying. Her career was important to her, a key part of her identity. So I attacked her where it would hurt most, but again, slowly. It started with small disruptions. An important work document misplaced, a key piece of information she needed for a meeting mysteriously going missing. She became frazzled, trying to compensate for mistakes she didn't even realize I had engineered. I watched as she stayed up later, working longer hours, increasingly agitated as her performance at work began to suffer. Her boss became critical, and I could see the cracks forming in her perfect facade, but still she didn't suspect me. I even manipulated her schedule, making her late for important meetings by accidentally taking the car keys or changing the time on her phone alarm. I made sure her stress was compounded by these little failures that she couldn't explain. She began to feel out of control, like everything was slipping through her fingers. And yet I was always there to reassure her, to offer support in her moments of doubt. The best part was that she never connected the dots. Her arrogance had made her blind to the reality unfolding around her. She thought she could maintain her affair, thought she could mock me behind my back and still control her motive. But every step she took forward was one I had set in place. Every decision she made was based on a false sense of security that I had crafted for her. She became more erratic, more paranoid. I watched as she started second-guessing herself, searching for explanations that weren't there. I'd notice her checking her phone constantly, probably waiting for messages from him, trying to grasp onto something solid while everything else fell apart. There was a frantic edge to her now, something raw and desperate. At home, she grew more tense, more irritable. The smallest things set her off. An empty dishwasher, the wrong kind of coffee in the pantry, a mess left by the dog. She snapped at me once about leaving the kitchen light on, her voice shrill and out of character. I pretended to be surprised, apologized as any decent husband would, but inside I was smiling. The cracks were widening. The culmination of it all came with the work event. It was her company's annual gala, a black tie affair where she was supposed to network with clients and make a good impression. She had been anxious about it for weeks, especially since her performance at work had been under scrutiny. She needed the night to go well, to prove to her colleagues and her bosses that she was still on top of her game. I made sure that wouldn't happen. It started innocently enough. She looked stunning in her dress, every inch the confident professional as we walked into the hotel ballroom. But I had already set things in motion. I had tipped off one of her more competitive colleagues, an ambitious woman who had been vying for the same promotion my wife coveted, about a small error in the presentation materials. The mistake was something my wife had overlooked, something small but crucial. When her colleague brought it up in front of the room, it was subtle, almost polite, but the effect was devastating. I watched as the color drained from my wife's face, her confidence shattered in an instant. She tried to recover, of course, but the damage was done. Whispers spread throughout the room, people exchanging looks of disbelief. She fumbled through the rest of the night, unable to regain her footing. It was a public humiliation, and though no one else knew it, it had been orchestrated by me. That night, when we returned home, she broke down. I held her as she sobbed, her body shaking with the weight of her failure. "I don't know what's happening," she whispered. "Everything's falling apart." I stroked her hair, murmuring soft words of comfort. Inside, I felt nothing but satisfaction. This was what I had wanted, her complete unraveling. She didn't realize that the very person she was clinging to for support was the one who had orchestrated her downfall. Every tear she shed was a victory for me, but it wasn't enough. The final blow was yet to come. I had been saving the best for last, the affair. I wanted her to feel the same sense of betrayal I had felt, the same cold realization that her life had been a lie. But I wasn't going to confront her directly, not yet. I wanted the reveal to be devastating, public, and undeniable. It came at a family dinner. We had been planning it for weeks, a small gathering with her parents, her sister, and a few close friends. I had chosen the occasion carefully, knowing that she would feel safe and secure in the presence of people who loved her. I wanted her to be comfortable, relaxed, before I pulled the rug out from under her. The dinner began smoothly enough with polite conversation and laughter. She seemed almost herself again, relieved perhaps that the nightmare of the gala was behind her. But as dessert was served, I decided it was time. I began by asking her a simple question, something mundane about her day. She answered easily, smiling across the table at me. I pressed further, asking about a meeting she had mentioned earlier in the week. There was a flicker of confusion in her eyes, but she brushed it off, continuing to play the role of the perfect wife. Then I brought up the name of her lover, casually, as if it were part of the conversation. The room went silent. I watched the color drain from her face, the same way it had at the gala, but this time it was deeper, more profound. Her eyes widened, and for the first time in months, she looked at me with genuine fear. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice calm and even. "I thought you had mentioned him before. Wasn't he the one you met for lunch the other day?" Her parents looked confused, her sister frowning. Everyone's eyes were on her now, waiting for her response. She stammered, tried to laugh it off, but I wasn't finished. "I'm sure I saw a message from him on your phone," I continued, my tone light, conversational. "Something about missing you? That doesn't sound like just a colleague to me." Her composure shattered in front of me. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The room was deathly quiet, the tension thick and suffocating. Everyone was staring at her, waiting for an explanation, but there was none. I watched as the reality of her situation sank in. She had been exposed, not just to me, but to everyone she cared about. There was no hiding now, no way to twist the truth. I had orchestrated this moment perfectly, and it was everything I had imagined it would be. She was ruined. The rest of the dinner was a blur. Her family tried to console her, but there was no coming back from this. I had taken everything from her friends, her career, her reputation. And now I had taken the one thing she had left, her dignity. As I stood there watching her sob, I felt a strange emptiness settle in my chest. The victory should have felt sweeter, more satisfying. But instead, it felt hollow, as if something inside me had been lost in the process. I had destroyed her, just as I had planned. But in doing so, I realized I had destroyed something in myself as well. The moment had finally arrived. Everything I had set in motion, the financial disruptions, the subtle social isolations, the psychological games, had all built up to this. I had prepared meticulously, each step bringing her life closer to ruin, while keeping myself carefully concealed behind a mask of concern. She suspected nothing, and that was her fatal mistake. Tonight, however, would be different. I was done hiding in the shadows, done manipulating from a distance. Tonight I would reveal everything, not with the explosive rage she might have expected had she known what I knew. No, I would remain as composed and calculated as ever, peeling away the illusion she had lived in for so long with a surgical precision. And when it was over, there would be no doubt left, no escape for her. I was going to strip her of the control she thought she had, piece by piece. It was a charity event, one we had attended together for years, a night filled with expensive wine, high-profile clients, and the kind of performative socializing that used to amuse me. She was always good at these things, mastering the art of charm and elegance, effortlessly gliding through the crowd, smiling at the right people, saying the right things. But tonight I had made sure her confidence would be her downfall. The dinner had already begun when we arrived, a late entrance that drew eyes toward us, as planned. She looked stunning, of course, in a deep green gown that perfectly complemented her eyes. She knew she looked good. She always did. I could sense the familiar satisfaction radiating off her as people complimented her appearance, her perfect smile flashing under the dim lights of the ballroom. But tonight I wasn't impressed. I wasn't charmed by her performance. As we were seated, she took her place beside me, casually greeting the others at our table. She had no idea that the entire night had already been scripted. Every word, every action designed to unravel her. I had spent weeks ensuring everything would go exactly as planned. A carefully placed comment here, a subtle suggestion there, and suddenly the people who had once admired her so fully were now part of the conspiracy against her. It was almost too easy. The first real crack appeared during the main course. One of our friends, a man she respected greatly, turned to her and asked an innocent question. "So how's work been going lately? I heard about the missed deadline a few weeks back." Her smile faltered just a fraction, a tiny slip, but enough for me to notice. She hadn't told anyone about the work issues. I knew that for a fact because I had been the one orchestrating those little failures behind the scenes. Watching her now, I could see the panic begin to creep in, though she quickly masked it with a well-rehearsed laugh. "Oh, you know how it is," Shelley said smoothly. "Just a bit of a hiccup, nothing major." But it was major. Her job was teetering on the edge thanks to me. Her boss had been less than pleased with her recent performance, and I had made sure that key opportunities had slipped through her fingers, causing her to look unreliable at work. I watched her try to deflect the conversation, but the damage was done. Doubt had already been planted in the minds of those around us. After dessert, the speeches began. It was the part of the evening I had always found dull, pandering to wealthy donors, thanking people for their support. But this time I was waiting for the right moment. I leaned toward her, my voice low so only she could hear me. "You seem a little tense," I said, keeping my tone light, almost playful. "Everything all right?" She turned to me, her eyes flashing with irritation. "I'm fine," she said through clenched teeth, though her forced smile never wavered. I let the silence between us linger, letting her feel my presence next to her without saying another word. The tension between us had been building for weeks, but she still believed she had control. She thought whatever strain she was feeling could be fixed, that things would somehow return to normal. She didn't realize that normal was long gone, buried beneath the weight of her lies and my carefully constructed plan. As the final speech concluded, I stood. I could feel the eyes of the room turning toward me as I had anticipated. I held my wine glass in hand, lifting it slightly in a gesture of a toast. "If I may," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs of conversation. "I'd like to make a small addition." She turned toward me, confused but not yet alarmed. After all, I was always the calm, steady one, the dependable husband who never caused a scene. That was the role I had played for years, and I had played it well. But tonight, I was rewriting the script. "I just want to take a moment to acknowledge how grateful I am for my wife," I said, meeting her eyes across the table. "She's been such a support, especially in the last few months as we've navigated certain challenges." Her expression froze, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. I continued, unbothered by the widening eyes of our friends around the table. "We've always been very transparent with each other," I went on, "but sometimes life throws unexpected curveballs. You know, like discovering that your wife of 17 years has been having an affair." The room fell deathly silent. For a moment I savored it, the collective gasp of shock, the sudden stiffening of her posture beside me. Her eyes widened, and her mouth opened slightly as if she was about to speak, but no words came out. I turned to her, my voice calm, almost soothing. "I know, darling. I've known for a while." Her face paled, the blood draining from her cheeks as the reality of the situation crashed over her. The others at the table shifted uncomfortably, unsure of where to look, their gazes darting between us as if trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. "I didn't want to believe it at first," I said, addressing the table now, my tone conversational. "But the evidence was too clear. The messages, the missed meetings, the unexplained absences. I guess I was the last to know. Isn't that always the way? She looked at me, horror dawning in her eyes, and for the first time in all of this, I saw genuine fear. The room had become a pressure cooker, the weight of the revelation hanging in the air, crushing her under its force. She glanced at the others, searching for anyone to intervene, but no one moved. No one spoke. I continued, my voice never wavering. It wasn't just the affair, though. No, it was the way you mocked me, the way you laughed at how blind I was, how stupid I must have seemed. I'm sure you thought you had everything under control, didn't you? Her hand trembled as she reached for her wine glass, her fingers closing around the stem like a lifeline. She lifted it to her lips, but her hand was shaking too much to take a sip. She set it back down, clumsily, the sound of the glass clinking against the table deafening in the silence. I let her sit with the weight of her choices for a moment longer before leaning in slightly, lowering my voice just enough that only she could hear. I know everything, I whispered. I've known for months, and now, so does everyone else. Her breathing grew shallow, panic flooding her features as she realized the depth of the trap she had fallen into. There was no escape, no explanation that could undo what I had just revealed. Her world was collapsing around her, and I had made sure there was nothing left for her to hold on to. I straightened, raising my glass again. To honesty, I said, my voice ringing clear across the table. It's always better to know the truth, don't you think? The others at the table remained silent, stunned into immobility by the scene unfolding before them. They looked at her, then back at me, unsure of how to respond. I didn't care. Their reactions were irrelevant. This wasn't about them. It was about her. It was about watching her crumble under the weight of her own lies. Her voice finally broke through the silence, though it was weak, barely more than a whisper. Why? Why are you doing this? I looked at her, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight of everything I had done. The manipulations, the leases, the carefully calculated steps to bring her to this moment. And yet, as I stood there victorious in my revenge, I felt nothing. Because you deserve it, I said, my voice cold, devoid of the satisfaction I had expected to feel. Because you lied, and you thought you could get away with it. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a brief moment I almost felt a flicker of regret. But it was fleeting, the damage was done. I had won. Without another word, I set my glass down on the table and turned to leave. I didn't need to see the rest. I didn't need to watch her beg or plead or try to salvage what was left of her dignity. The victory was mine, and I had no desire to linger in the ruins I had created. As I walked out of the room, leaving her behind, I felt an emptiness settle over me, a hollow, gnawing sensation that I hadn't anticipated. I had destroyed her, just as I had planned, but in the process, I had destroyed something in myself as well. I stepped outside into the cool night air, taking a deep breath. The weight of my actions hung heavily on me now, pressing down with an almost unbearable force. I had thought this moment would bring closure, that the revenge I had so carefully crafted would fill the void she had created. But instead I felt nothing, nothing at all. The silence after my words hung thick in the air, suffocating, pressing in on every side. I watched her seated across from me, frozen in place. The fork she had been holding dropped from her hand and clattered loudly against her plate. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She was stunned, utterly blindsided. I had taken my time, laid the groundwork, and waited for the precise moment to strike. And now here it was. The restaurant, still dimly lit with the soft glow of candles, was our favorite. We'd celebrated anniversaries here, toasted career milestones, and whispered about future plans over wine and candlelight. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was where I decided to destroy her, in the very place that had been a symbol of our supposed happiness. I kept my gaze on her, calm, controlled. Her eyes flickered with panic as she glanced around, clearly calculating how to respond, how to regain control of the narrative. But she couldn't, not this time. How long have you known? Her voice was barely audible, shaky, like she could barely muster the strength to form the words. Long enough, I said, my tone measured. There was no need for anger now. The time for rage had long passed. Now it was about the methodical delivery of the truth. Cold, hard, undeniable truth. She swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of the table as though she were holding on for dear life. Her eyes darted to the people around us, strangers seated at nearby tables, oblivious to the drama unfolding right next to them. She was looking for an escape, a way out, but there was none. Not now, not after I had laid everything bare. I, I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, desperation creeping into her voice. It was a weak attempt, and we both knew it. I leaned back in my chair, letting her words hang in the air between us. I know about him, I said evenly, my voice carrying the weight of the months of deception I had uncovered. I know about the affair. The meetings, the lies, all of it. Her face crumpled, and for a brief moment I thought she might break down. But she held herself together, barely. It wasn't like that, she whispered, shaking her head as if denying the reality of what she had done would somehow change it. You don't understand. Don't I asked, my voice sharp now. I've read the messages. I've seen the way you mocked me behind my back, how you laughed at how oblivious I was. You didn't think I'd ever find out, did you? Her eyes widened, and I saw the flicker of realization there, that I had seen everything. She was trapped, with no way to talk herself out of it. Please, she said, her voice breaking. We can fix this. We can... I held up a hand, cutting her off. No. There's no fixing this. Not anymore, Saram. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. For the first time in years, she had no words. I could see her scrambling, searching for something to say, but the truth was too heavy, too overwhelming. She couldn't deny it any longer. I trusted you, I said, my voice low but firm. I gave you everything, and you threw it all away. For what? Some cheap affair? To feel powerful, to feel like you were in control? Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy, no compassion. That part of me had been burned out, scorched by the fire of her betrayal. I thought, she began, her voice trembling, I thought you didn't care anymore. I thought you didn't see me. Her words were pathetic, hollow, and I felt my stomach churn with disgust. She was playing the victim now, trying to make me believe that her actions were somehow my fault, but I wasn't going to let her rewrite the story. I saw everything, I said coldly. You just didn't think I was paying attention, but I was. I've been paying attention for a long time. She flinched at the ice in my words, and I saw the full weight of what I was saying begin to settle in. There was no redemption for her, no forgiveness. I wasn't here to give her a second chance. I was here to watch her fall apart, just like she had watched me without even realizing it. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, because even now, after all the planning, all the careful execution, a part of me had expected to feel something more. Some solid sense of closure, some rush of satisfaction. But instead, I felt hollow. There's more, I said quietly, and I saw her eyes widen in fear. You didn't just betray me with your affair. You betrayed me in every way possible. Financially, personally. You took from me while laughing at my back. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice small, fragile, but I saw the cracks deepening in her facade. I gave her no respite, leaning forward slightly. Do you really think I didn't notice? The money you siphoned out of our business accounts? You didn't think I'd find out that too? Her face went pale, and for a moment she looked like she might faint. That was for us, she whispered. I thought I could. You thought you could rob me blind, and I wouldn't notice. My voice was colder than I had ever heard it. You thought I was a fool. She sat there, speechless, the weight of everything crashing down on her. The affair was bad enough, but this was worse. This was her final undoing, the truth she had buried deep, thinking I would never dig it up. I'm done, I said simply, standing up. The sound of the chair scraping against the floor was loud, cutting through the tense silence between us. I'm done pretending. You've destroyed everything. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face now, her makeup smeared. Please, she sobbed, reaching for me, but I stepped back out of her reach. "No," I said firmly. "You don't get to beg now. You don't get to fix this. There's nothing left to fix." The restaurant was still busy around us, but it felt like we were the only two people in the world in that moment. She was crumbling in front of me, and part of me felt triumphant. This was what I had wanted, after all. I had waited for this moment, planned for it meticulously. I had imagined the satisfaction of watching her world fall apart just as mine had. But the satisfaction I had anticipated wasn't there. It was empty, hollow, like ashes in my mouth. I watched her for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, leaving her behind. I didn't care about the scene we had caused, about the whispers that would surely follow us out of that restaurant. None of it mattered anymore. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the breeze cutting through the warmth of the day. I inhaled deeply, expecting to feel some sense of release, but instead I felt the weight of everything I had done pressing down on me. I had won, hadn't I? I had executed my plan perfectly, exposed her lies and destroyed her. But standing there, I realized something I hadn't expected. In destroying her, I had also destroyed a part of myself. I walked down the street, each step feeling heavier than the last. I had spent months carefully orchestrating her downfall, manipulating every aspect of her life until she had nothing left. But now that it was done, I was left with the same emptiness that had driven me to this point in the first place. I had thought that revenge would fill that void, that once I had taken everything from her, I would feel whole again. But instead, it felt like I had just dug the hole deeper. She had been the one to betray me, to mock me, to destroy our life together. But in the end, I had become something darker, something colder than I had ever imagined. I had taken control, yes, but in the process, I had lost something that I couldn't get back. I stopped walking, standing still in the middle of the sidewalk, the city lights glowing around me. For a moment, I closed my eyes, trying to remember the man I had been before all of this. The man who had loved her, who had trusted her, who had believed in the life they had built together. But that man was gone, erased by the weight of betrayal and revenge. I opened my eyes, staring blankly at the world around me. The victory I had sought had come at a cost, and now I wasn't sure if it had been worth it. I had won, but in the end I had lost everything that mattered. I stood alone in the quiet of my study, the weight of everything pressing down on me like a boulder that had finally found its resting place. The echoes of the night's events replayed in my mind. Her tear-streaked face, the gasps of those around us, the silence that followed my revelations. It should have felt like victory. I had executed my plan flawlessly, laid bare her secrets, her betrayals, and shattered the life she thought she controlled. And yet, standing there in the aftermath, I felt hollow. Revenge had been my sole purpose for so long that now, with it complete, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. I had crafted each moment with precision, turning her life into a carefully constructed nightmare. I had made her feel small, insignificant, just as she had made me feel. But the satisfaction I had imagined, the closure eluded me. Instead, I was left with a gnawing emptiness. I walked to the window, staring out at the dark, quiet street below. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of traffic, the world moving on, indifferent to the chaos I had just unleashed. My reflection in the glass looked foreign, as if I were seeing a stranger looking back at me. Who was this man? The one who had orchestrated the downfall of the woman he once loved, who had spent months weaving a web of lies only to find himself caught in it too. I had been in control every step of the way. Every move she made I had anticipated. Every response she gave had been accounted for. But now, in the stillness of the night, I realized that control had come at a price. The man I used to be, the one who had loved her, trusted her, he was gone. I had become someone else in the pursuit of revenge, someone colder, more calculating. And now that it was done, I wasn't sure I liked who I had become. There was no going back, of course. The damage was done. I had destroyed her, exposed her affair, humiliated her in front of everyone she cared about. Her reputation, her career, her life, it was all in ruins now, and I had made sure of that. But as I stood there, I couldn't help but wonder if I had destroyed more than just her. Had I also destroyed myself in the process? The phone buzzed on the desk behind me, pulling me from my thoughts. I didn't need to check it to know who it was. Messages of concern, of shock, would be flooding in from friends, family, people who had witnessed the spectacle I had created. But I couldn't bring myself to care. Their opinions didn't matter to me anymore. I had distanced myself from them, just as I had distanced myself from everything else in my life. All that had mattered was the plan, the revenge. And now that it was over, there was nothing left. I turned away from the window and walked to the bookshelf on the far wall. It was lined with photos, snapshots of a life that felt distant now, pictures of us smiling on vacations, at parties, living a life that had seemed perfect at the time. But every smile in those photos felt false now, tainted by the lies that had been hidden underneath. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the edge of one of the frames, and for a moment, I considered smashing it, destroying the last remnants of the life we had shared. But I stopped myself. What was the point? It was already gone. I sat down in the armchair by the fireplace, leaning back as I stared up at the ceiling. The weight of the night settled deeper into my bones, and I closed my eyes, letting the silence wash over me. I had thought revenge would be the answer, that it would bring me peace, but now I wasn't sure what I had expected. The emptiness I felt was worse than the anger that had driven me. At least the anger had given me something to hold on to, something to drive me forward. But this was nothingness. I opened my eyes again, the room feeling colder, darker than before. What now? What was left for me after this? I had spent so long consumed by my need to destroy her that I had never stopped to think about what came next. Could I go back to my life? To work, to friends, to the daily grind that had once been enough for me? I didn't know anymore. There was no satisfaction in her downfall, only a bitter realization that in trying to punish her, I had lost myself. The man who had loved, trusted, and lived without suspicion had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. And the worst part, I didn't know how to find my way back to him. I thought about her, about what she must be feeling now. The humiliation, the betrayal, the collapse of her carefully curated world. In a way, I had given her exactly what she deserved, but there was no victory in it. She was ruined, yes, but so was I. I had imagined this moment so many times, pictured the look on her face when the truth came crashing down on her. But now all I could think about was the quantum, the bitterness, the emptiness. Was this really what I had wanted? Had it all been worth it? I wasn't sure anymore. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the only sound in the room, and I let the warmth wash over me. I was tired, exhausted from months of plotting, from the weight of the secrets I had carried, from the burden of my own hatred. I had spent so long seeking revenge that I hadn't stopped to think about what would be left of me when it was over. Now I was left to confront that reality. I had taken everything from her, but in the process I had taken everything from myself as well. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done. All I could do now was sit in the ashes of the life I had burned down and wonder what came next. I stared into the flames, watching them flicker and dance, and for the first time in a long time, I felt uncertain.